Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Collaborative Gains webinar on continuous product discovery. I'm your host, David Forrest, the General Manager for the Councils, and I'm joined by my partner in crime, Brittany Crown. Brittany, as most of you know, leads our 365 program here at Collaborative Gain, and she's been bringing our members together at happy hours, small dinners, RFH calls, and webinars like this one. If you have an idea for a call or a webinar, or if you'd like to help host a small dinner or happy hour in your area, please reach out to Brittany at collaborativegame.com and she'll coordinate with you and get that rolling. Today, we're really excited to be joined by our special guest, Teresa Torres. Teresa is not only a fantastic moderator for one of Collaborative Gain's senior executive product councils, but she's also one of the most well-respected product discovery coaches in the industry. Teresa holds her bachelor's degree from Stanford and her master's in learning and organizational change from Northwestern University. And she joins us today to talk about continuous product discovery and really how you can use it to help your company bring products to market that you're going to know your customers want. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But Teresa, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're very excited to have you, and this is going to be great. So let me turn the controls over to you, and you can get started.
All right, perfect. Well, as David said, I do work as a product discovery coach. I work with a lot of different types of companies. I coach the cross-functional team. We're going to talk a little bit about that today as we get into continuous discovery. And one of the things that I wanted to do in this presentation is just share a little bit about what I see as common practice at companies where people have some challenges with adopting continuous discovery. For those of you that might be unfamiliar with this term or you've heard of it, but you're not quite sure what it is, we're going to cover that as well. So there's not a whole lot of prerequisite knowledge required. Just to give you a little bit about my background so you have some context for where this material is coming from. I have spent the last 4 years working with companies of all sizes, from really early stage startups to much larger Fortune 500 companies. I typically am brought in by a head of product, and I'm working with organizations where they've said, we need more of the voice of the customer in our business. We need our product teams to know how to run better at product experiments, to understand customer needs. And more recently, I've been brought in when leaders say things like, my teams are doing all the right activities, but it's not changing what they're building. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, because I think that's what's behind deriving this shift towards continuous product discovery. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's see. So the first thing I want to start with, and this is going to seem really obvious, but I know when I start working with teams, it's really easy for people to start thinking that the challenges in their organization are people problems. And I'll tell you, at every company that I've worked with every product team that I've worked on, with no exception, the teams that I work with, they want to build products that create value for the customers. Excuse me. I think this is a pretty safe thing to assume about all of your product teams, whether it's your product managers, your designers, or your software engineers, is that almost all of us as human beings, we want to work on something that matters. The challenge is that isn't always the outcome, right? We tend to build a lot of features that people don't use. We have products that fail. We have products that maybe are even worse than a failure. They're kind of mediocre, so it makes it hard to kill them. So really what's getting in the way, and what I've seen is it's less about individual people, and it's more about the right org structure or the wrong org structure is in place, or we're using the wrong product processes, or really we just haven't matured our discovery methods, and that's what's getting in the way. So almost always it's less about the people. Obviously we do have to do some skill development in people as our methods evolve. But usually it's a lot more systemic than that. So that's something that we'll talk through as well. All right, so I really do want to just start at the very simple basics, right? Every product team has to decide what to build, and then they have to go out and build it. And this sounds very obvious, but in most organizations, we prioritize delivery over discovery. So we spend a lot of time and energy talking about switching to agile, velocity of our teams, how we write user stories, how quickly we're shipping, all like sorting out dependencies between teams. We put a lot of mental energy into, are we delivering fast enough? It's only recently that teams have really started to focus on, are we making good decisions about what to build? And our practice in the industry is really starting to mature here. So here's a scenario where I really want to start at the very beginning. And this next slide, if my transitions don't work, actually most of my slides are going to be a problem if my transitions don't work. Let's see how this goes. Well, we're just going to work through it. I apologize for what's going to look like a noisy slide. It was meant to be released to you in layers. Okay, so we're going to start with, a lot of companies still work under this model where they start with an idea. Who knows where the idea came from? The product team builds it, they release it, and they assume that it works. Now, hopefully most of you are not working this way. I think as an industry, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, we've mostly moved away from it. We've moved away from it because of some pretty common challenges. One is we tend to live in opinion land, right? So, and this, if you're familiar with the acronym HIPPO, the highest paid opinion wins. We tend to get into arguments about whose idea is better. And these HIPPO arguments actually happen both vertically and horizontally. So vertically, they happen amongst our product managers, our designers, and our engineers, which is why we see problems crop up like who has final say, the product manager or the designer. But they also happen vertically, where a product team goes off and works, and then the CEO comes in and says, hey, I have this pet idea. Or as we've built out our technology orgs to include design, to include PMO organizations, we're actually seeing a lot more department leaders kind of fly in with their favorite pet ideas. And so because we're not putting a lot of emphasis on where ideas come from and how we choose them, we spend a ton of time in opinion land. And then almost always, because of the HIPPO situation, ideas kind of get pushed down. So our stakeholders prioritize, and then we end up, it kicks off this factory floor way of building products. Our product managers write requirements, our designers design, our engineers code. Now, this sounds a lot like waterfall, but I will tell you, most agile companies work this way. And Marty Kagan has a great term for it. He calls it mini waterfall, right? Where we just took our 8-month project and we squeezed it into 2-week increments, but we're still working in our functional silos, handing things off one to the other. And the problem with this, of course, is that it leads to a lot of bugs. Our engineers don't know why they're building what they're building. So every day they make little decisions that lead to the wrong functionality. They miss their deadlines because we don't build a shared sense of urgency. We don't get creative problem solving from our team because no single person on the team works on the project end to end. The team doesn't feel ownership because of that. And ultimately the outcome is we have unhappy customers who tend to complain a lot. Now, fortunately, I think most teams in the industry have started to realize this is not good enough. And one of the things we saw in the early 2000s was really the growth of user experience. And user experience has helped a lot with this, where we started to add some steps in this process. So in this next iteration on kind of how we've worked, it always started with an idea. Instead of saying engineers go build this idea, we gave it to some designers. They designed it. Maybe they ran a usability test. They built it. And then, of course, they still assumed it worked. Now, this was a good iteration. Obviously, getting feedback. First of all, having a designer use their design skills to make something easier to use is always a good thing. Getting some feedback through usability testing, obviously always a good thing. But it doesn't solve all of our problems. So if we look here, we still have the HIPPO problem because we inserted steps after the idea phase. So we're still having our opinion battles about which ideas are good. That hasn't changed at all. We're still working in a factory floor model where maybe the product manager writes the requirements, the designer does the design and the usability test, and then it still goes to engineering for building. And so we get the same outcomes. We might get fewer customer complaints because we learn about problems in our usability test. But what I see pretty frequently is that we ignore what we learn in our usability tests. And that's for several reasons. The first is that we tend to test our entire design. So think about it this way. Your product team has a new feature idea, and they give the designers go away and they work on the feature and they design the entire thing end to end. And it's only when they're done with the design that they say, let's usability test it. And the problem with that is that most of our features are too complex to get valid, good feedback in a usability study. We actually want to user test different parts of it. When we test the whole design, it's really hard to get specific feedback. We tend to get glaring problems like maybe the button, they don't understand a button, or we see big structural problems, but we don't have time to fix it. The other problem is we tend to only test our best option. So a designer, like especially for companies that do design studios, they might run through 5, 6, 7, 8 different design variations, but they don't have time to test all those variations. So as a design team, they choose the best option and they put it in front of users. Well, the challenge there is if there's problems with it, they're too far into the process to actually move to an alternative. So in a lot of scenarios, we're not actually considering alternatives when we usability test. Another challenge we run into is that we often explain away what we learn. And this happens usually when we outsource our usability testing to a centralized user research team or to even an outside agency, where it's really easy for the product team to say, well, I don't believe the research because they tested with the wrong people. I don't like the way they did the test. Our users are different. Our context is different. When the product team doesn't own the research themselves, it's really easy for them to say, I don't believe it. Plain and simple.
Is this a hippo blind spot, Teresa? These are just biases creeping in.
Yeah, I mean that's all of this, and part of it is methodical, right? We're doing usability testing at the wrong point in the process. We're doing it after we're done with the design. And actually, for a lot of teams, usability testing happens even after it's been built. And that's the last challenge here. If we usability test after we're done building, we're committed to our release schedule. And the only changes we're going to make are the really small cosmetic changes because we don't have time for anything else.
So
if you look at what's
pause for just one second.
Go ahead,
and I want to ask the audience, this is not you asking a question, but if in your own organizations you've got people who are explaining away usability tests and customer research based on what they want to believe, just raise your hand in your interface. Okay, I see a bunch of hands going.
And here's what I'll say. This isn't nefarious, right? Your teams aren't actively trying to disbelieve the research. This is our human brains at work. It's just due to cognitive biases. If we don't own the research, we don't take responsibility for what we're learning, and it's easy for us to discredit it. And so if we look at all these factors on the right, we don't get specific enough feedback. We don't consider alternative designs. We don't believe the research. Even if we did believe the research, we have no time to make the changes. We don't actually change anything. So if we're not going to change anything, all we get by introducing usability testing into our process is we just slowed down our process. And I've seen this happen time and time again. Teams get excited about usability testing, they introduce it into the process, they don't make any changes to their product, and they start usability testing less often because all it's doing is it's slowing them down. So this doesn't work. So first of all, if the only thing that you're doing is usability testing and it's happening this late in the process, you're just scratching the surface on discovery. Now, if we have lean startup advocates in the audience, which I'm going to guess we do, lean startup that came out in 2011, so almost 6 years ago, introduced a new idea, which is it's not just about usability testing. It's we actually have to measure our outcomes, right? So we shouldn't just have an idea, design it, usability test it, build it, and hope it works out. We should measure it and make sure that it had the intended impact. And in this case, the vast majority of companies are measuring by running A/B tests. And A/B tests are a great way to measure, right? It's a controlled test. We're splitting our traffic. Hopefully it's random. And we're looking at, did this new thing perform better than this old thing? Now, we still have problems here. So we still have not addressed our hippos because you'll notice measuring happens at the end. It has nothing to do with how we're choosing ideas. We're still working in a factory. Most of the time our designers are still designing, our engineers are still building. Maybe our engineers are measuring, maybe our product managers are measuring. We still have a lot of the challenges on the right-hand side. And really where the lean startup has some, in practice, has some big limitations is, one, we confuse decisions with measuring. So what I mean by that is to try to avoid the hippo debate, we have 4 or 5 ideas. We can't resolve our opinions. So we say, let's split test them. So instead of building one design, we're building 4 or 5 designs. We're running them against each other and we're checking to see which one wins. All we've done by doing that is we removed judgment from the process, which is not good. Like, our goal with quantitative testing isn't to remove our human judgment from the process. It's to evaluate our human judgment, right? So we want to think about A/B testing as a measurement and not as a way of making decisions. But the bigger problem with this method is that for most teams that I work with, and this is not just with companies that are asking for help, I see it in talking to people at the cocktail hour and collaborative gain, I see it everywhere. Most teams' tests never fail. And this is not because all their ideas are good. It's not because all of their changes are winners. It's because they have really poor experiment design. The biggest mistake that I see is that teams are cherry picking whatever metric goes up to call their test a winner, instead of deciding ahead of time what to measure and using that as the evaluation of their test. And so again, even when we start to introduce measurement, we're seeing this combination of, we're removing human judgment from the decision, we're combining it with poor experiment design, and the outcome is we're building the exact same thing we intended to build from the very beginning. If we look at the beginning of our process, we still build the original idea that originated in that hippo argument. Absolutely nothing has changed.
Teresa, pause for a second. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people are doing it this way? Is it that they can't, the cognitive dissonance, they don't want to believe that their idea ends up being a bad one, or is there something else at play here?
I think it's several things. So one is the cognitive bias, the escalation of commitment. So the more that we invest in our idea, the more committed we're going to be into it, right? So to go through this really linear process, have ideas, do the design, usability test it, build it. As product teams, we've invested a ton into our ideas. So that by the time we get to that measurement, we're so far committed, confirmation bias is gonna come into play. We're gonna look for all the evidence for why it worked, and we're gonna ignore all the evidence for why it didn't work. So that's just one reason, is just our simple cognitive biases. But another reason is this challenge with time, right? So we're really pushing our teams to deliver every week, every day for a lot of teams. And we're confusing that with these big releases that we used to do under a project mindset. And we're going to talk about project versus continuous mindset in a little bit. But I think it's not just cognitive biases, it's also the way we framed our work is putting time pressure on our teams so that they can't do the right things.
Gotcha. Now that makes sense.
I want to ask David's question earlier again. Is this resonating with people? Do you guys see this at your companies? Are your tests failing ever? Are you guys using experiments to decide rather than to measure?
Yeah,
I don't know if I can see if you're raising your hands.
I see hands going up and down. Yes.
Okay.
This resonates with people.
Okay. So let's look at the third kind of introduction we've seen. So thanks to design thinking and the jobs to be done framework and customer development, we're seeing a lot of teams introduce empathy research to the beginning of their process. So they're going out and they're interviewing their customers, they're doing customer observations, and they're using that as inspiration for where their ideas come from. This is awesome, right? This is much better than having a bunch of executives sit in a room and just generate ideas. Ideas are actually starting to emerge from what we learn about our customers. And so it's the first change that we've seen that's starting to change how we think about ideas, right? So I would say of the three, this is one of the most powerful ones. But we still have a lot of the same problems. And the reason why, again, is because of our biases. So we could go out and do great research and bring our research back to our organization and share it with everybody. And if we're still operating under this model where everybody in this org chart is contributing to prioritization and contributing to deciding which ideas to pursue. When each of us looks at that research, because of confirmation bias, we're still going to see what we want to see. So if you have a favorite idea, you're still going to look at all that empathy research and see the elements that confirm what you were looking for. And if someone else has a different favorite idea, they're going to see the different supporting experience. And I'm sure all of you have had the experience, whether it's in the product world, whether it was whether it was a job applicant that was interviewing, where you have 2 or 3 people in the room hearing the exact same thing, and they walk away with completely different interpretations. Right?
Yep.
Like, this is just part of the human experience.
So
and
hey, Teresa,
yeah, go ahead.
Let's pause for a second because I want to. I think Kirsten Thayer, pardon me, has a comment, and I think Lauren Antonelli might have a question as well. So I'm going to call on Kirsten real quick.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can unmute Kirsten. Oh, Kirsten, it says something about unmuting to. You need to enter your PIN. I don't know if you entered a PIN number. But so Lauren lowered her hand, so she may not have a question. But okay, so I apologize. Continue.
Okay. And if we're having audio problems, people can type questions.
Actually,
in the chat
Kirsten, I think may now be good. There we go. Hi, Kirsten. How are you?
I'm fine. I was just confirming you had asked the question. That's all. I was just confirming that we do the test validation in advance, but absolutely have so much confirmation bias that sometimes it doesn't matter.
So can you give an example of that? That's Kirsten.
Yeah, we will put together, the test plans in advance and the measurement with our product managers and executives, but we'll have certain executives who really, because of their own stuff, don't care about the data, and they will interpret the findings the way that they see it, regardless of what actually is said. And many times they won't sit in on the studies, and those that do, they're just blindly saying, no, that's not the case. So they're just avoiding all fact.
Teresa, how do you help answer that question for somebody who's basically saying, listen, it's my butt on the line if this thing doesn't work. I don't care what your research says. This is what I want to do. Like, what's our response to that?
Yeah, so that is the second item on this slide, which is for the vast majority of teams, they're not doing their own research, right? They're supported by a centralized user research team that's doing the research for them, or an outside design agency is doing the research for them. And you're going to see when we get to my definition of continuous discovery, the research has to be done by the team building the product. It's the only way they're going to believe the results. Because if they question the research, their only next potential step is to redo the research. And that's a big part of this shift from project-based research to continuous research, is getting the team making the decisions to do the research. And that's what's going to help us avoid a lot of these biases. So we're about to get there.
Awesome.
Okay. So again, because of biases, but also because of how our orgs are set up, right? Centralized research team, different from the product team. It's hard for there to be have trust there. It's easy to rationalize why the research doesn't apply in your context. So while we're doing all the right things, we don't get meaningful changes. And this is really common. I meet teams all the time and they go, Teresa, we already know how to do discovery. We talk to our customers, we run experiments, we're doing empathy research, we're prototype testing, we use usertesting.com to run usability studies every day. And on paper, it looks like they're awesome teams. But in reality, they're actually making few meaningful changes from where they started. And as product leaders, the first thing that I would look for to evaluate your discovery process is, how often are we throwing ideas away? How often are our ideas changing? How often are we finding new things that are different from where we started? And if the answer isn't very often, there's probably some problems in your discovery process, even if all the activities look good on paper. So a lot of this is because, like I alluded to earlier, we're bringing a project mindset to our discovery work. Now, I think a lot of this is rooted in the fact that user experience, where a lot of these methods came from, grew up in external design agencies. And as an external organization, it's easier to sell a project than it is to sell continuous work, right? So a lot of this work got framed as big ticket project items because that's what builds consulting businesses. But now that we are moving all of this in-house on our dedicated teams, we can abandon the project mindset. And there's a lot of reasons why we should. So first of all, projects are big. We don't think about talking to a customer every couple of days. We talk about talking to 12 customers over 3 weeks. They take a long time, right? 3 weeks to do one round of customer interviews means you're going to do customer interviews once a quarter at best. So because they take a lot of time, we don't do them very often. They can be outsourced, and so we tend to outsource them. We give them to our centralized team. We give them to external research agencies. And the problem with outsourcing them is now our team doesn't trust them. The other challenge with projects is they can be sequenced. So I see teams all the time that come into this mindset with, first we do discovery, and then we do delivery. Well, that's a very dangerous mindset, because as we all know, as we start to build software, we realize all the limitations of the assumptions we made, and we have new questions. Every week that our software is being built, we have new questions that we need answers to. And if we think about discovery as the first phase, in delivery, when those questions come up, we're just going to guess at the answers. And we're still going to have all this risk in our project, in our products. Whereas if we think about them as intertwined, when those questions come up, we can use our discovery activities to quickly answer them. And then a really big one is, with projects, we're used to people playing different roles, right? So your product manager writes requirements, your designer designs, your engineers code. Now that's always going to be true. They're always going to play those roles, but you're going to see with a continuous mindset, we start to blur that a little bit. So a project mindset, and this is the key assumption here that we really want to pick apart. A project mindset assumes the role of our customer is to validate our ideas. So this is why a designer will spend 3 weeks coming up with the final solution before prototype testing. Because we're not looking for our customer to help us design. We're looking for our customer to say, yes, you got it right. And it's this mindset that I think is holding us back from a discovery standpoint, because we are not going to get it right most of the time. And if we take a validation mindset, we're going to get feedback way too late in the process. And this is the huge advantage we get from continuous discovery. A continuous mindset says, we don't look to our customers for validation. We want to co-create with them. We want them to get their hands dirty with us, to help play with ideas with us, to look at our half-baked ideas and create their own half-baked ideas. Now, some people hear this and they get scared because they think of Steve Jobs, who says that customers don't know what they want. That is the most polarizing quote, and it's both wrong and right? So the part that's right is, our customers are not experts on what we can do with technology. That's our job. Our job is to know what's possible with the technology that we have. But our customers are right and are experts about their own needs. And when we only look to validate, we're basically saying, did I get the solution right? And the answer is yes or no. If the answer is no, we have to just go back and guess again. Whereas if we co-create, what we're saying is, I know a lot about technology, you know a lot about your needs, let's work together and find a solution that works for both of us. And we get faster cycles and we get to good solutions much quicker. So I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like, because again, the thing I hear from most teams is it's so vague, they think they already do it. So I want to get really specific. But before we get into my very specific definition, I want to highlight 2 prerequisites. So there's 2 things that I think have to be in place before a team can adopt a continuous mindset. The first is, if your teams are spread across multiple projects, they physically cannot do continuous discovery. And I've had a lot of product leaders argue with me on this, and I've coached a lot of teams that were spread too thin, and it doesn't work. So if your product manager is responsible for 5 different products, you are not ready to do continuous discovery. If you're sharing designers across 5 Scrum teams, you're not ready to do continuous discovery. Same with your tech leads. And that's hard for a lot of organizations to hear, because most of our organizations are under-resourced, especially in product management and design. So my recommendation here would be to do this team by team. For your highest impact products, make sure your teams are dedicated. So at a minimum, your product manager, your lead designer, and your tech lead need to be dedicated full time to one product over time. So the over time piece means you don't put them on one product for one quarter and the next quarter you move them to another product. It's you give them a long time to focus on one product and let them make noticeable improvements, because that's what it takes. It takes spending a lot of time to really understand the context and the nuances and how the metrics are going to move. So this is at a minimum the first requirement.
So pause for 1 second.
Yeah.
Most orgs are structured in a way that have people going across multiple projects, A, because of core skill sets, but B, because they're trying a lot of things because they're not sure which one. They're taking a lot of tests and waiting for the customers to grade them on those tests, to use your metaphor, right?
Yeah.
And so it sounds to me, the way you're describing it, that continuous allows fewer tests but more meaningful kind of engagements with customers so that you get it right more often. Is that fair to say?
I actually think it leads to more tests.
Okay.
And we'll get into that. It's your tests get smaller, so you do them more frequently.
Gotcha.
Yep. This, by the way, what I'm describing is, if you've heard of the trio or the triad model, which I know is becoming really popular. I know that from what I've seen, most companies are not here yet, but they're trying to get here. Like, this doesn't feel like a controversial idea anymore. It is becoming the accepted norm. And what's hard about it is getting here, because we're under-resourced. So my advice on getting here is, don't try to get there across your organization in one fell swoop. You're going to have a lot of holes. You're not going to have enough designers. You're not going to have enough product managers. I would start with your most important products and make sure those teams are fully resourced. And then over time, as you can hire, fill out the rest of your teams, so that at least your highest impact parts of your product can shift to continuous discovery. Okay. What comes with this is all three of those roles need to be fully engaged with discovery. Now, this is, people give lip service to this, right? I think Marty Kagan has been talking about this for a long, long time. Engineers need to be involved in discovery. I think designers have been driving discovery for a long time, so that's not controversial. Product managers, I see it 50-50. Some product managers want to own discovery and don't want anybody else involved, and other product managers want their designers to do it all on their own. They don't want to be involved. The only way this works well is for all three to be involved, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, if we look at our hippo problem, we don't have hippos just up and down the hierarchy. We also have them horizontally, right? So a product manager decides, let's build something. The designer disagrees, and they argue about it. They finally come to agreement, and it goes to sprint planning, and an engineer disagrees, and they argue about it. We still have opinion battles. If we pull the designer, the product manager, and the tech lead, and we get them to do discovery together, and they together prioritize, and they together decide what's going to solve problems as they're co-creating with customers, all of those horizontal hippo problems go away completely. Now, the objection I get to this is, shouldn't my engineers be coding? And yes, your engineers should be coding, but at least one of them needs to be heavily involved in discovery. And as we talk about continuous, you'll see that discovery doesn't have to be a lot of time. So I'll say hold that objection for 2 slides. The third prerequisite is your teams have to be held accountable to outcomes and not outputs. And I know this is becoming a common mantra in the industry as well, but it's hard to do in practice, right? So an outcome is task a team with improving retention, reducing churn, increasing engagement, increasing customer satisfaction, not with an output, build an Android app or build feature A, B, and C. Now, because of the popularity of OKRs, this is becoming more popular. But it doesn't mean the hippos up the hierarchy aren't getting involved in influencing the outputs, right? So maybe the goal is being set as an outcome, but the leaders, whether it's a director of engineering or a head of product or a director of design, is coming in and saying, no, we have to do it this way. The problem with this is we're still having people in the building make the idea decisions, where we really want the idea decisions to happen between the team, our technology experts, and our customers, the customer needs experts, right? So if we're dictating outputs, it's really hard to get co-creation with our customers because we're too constrained by the organization dictating the solutions. So this is the second prerequisite. Let me pause there and see if there's questions about either of these two.
Anyone have questions or comments for Teresa on outcomes versus outputs? All right, let's call on Mark. Hey, Mark, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you, David?
Great.
Teresa, I'm wondering, as we talk about these things, there's buckets, there's sort of what we call big rocks, where we want to introduce a new product, a wholesale product, or move a metric, in an outcome-based way, in a fundamental way. And then there's what we've come to call pebbles in our organization, these sort of incremental features. Maybe we've left out a feature, and customers have been writing and saying, hey, why doesn't this also cover this use case, and so on. Do you feel that those kinds of things need to go through this process, or this same kind of evaluation, or is there some qualitative difference between the two?
That's a really good question, and I think I would want to dive in on your examples between big rocks and pebbles. My bias would be that most things should follow this kind of process. Now, how long the process takes will vary quite a bit for a big rock and a pebble. But even if you're pretty confident in your idea because you're getting a lot of feature requests and you hear it over and over again and it's pretty well known, I would argue that that feature will be better if you co-create with your customers than if you just design it and then validate it. So I think the scope definitely changes quite a bit from different needs. And there's always times, like the example I gave was between an outcome and an output was an Android app as an output. There will always be times where as a leadership team, you guys decide, like, we know we shouldn't be dictating outputs, but we think this output is a strategic initiative for the company, and you're going to tell your team to drive that output. I think that's always going to be the case. I think even within that scope, I would look for how do you co-create that output with your customers rather than just validating what you want to build.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah. All right. Any other questions for Teresa before we keep going? All right. And there'll be an opportunity afterwards to ask some other questions and comments at the end. So, all right.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So if we assume that you have dedicated teams, you have your trio in place, and that they're tasked with an outcome, this is what continuous discovery looks like in my world. I want that team to have, at a minimum, weekly touch points with customers. And we're going to talk a little bit about what touch points look like. For me, it's really important that it's by the team building the product. This is how we're going to get around that no belief challenge. And then where they themselves conduct small research activities in pursuit of a desired product outcome. And we're going to look at each of these individually. So we'll break this down. So why weekly touch points with customers? So first of all, every team that I have ever worked with, this cadence terrifies them. And it's because I've worked with teams that have never talked to a customer. So when I tell them they're going to talk to a customer every week, they get really scared. They all end up doing it. And here's the value. It becomes a forcing function. When we think about validating versus co-creating, we schedule a customer touch point when we're done and we're ready to validate. When we're done, we're too committed to our idea to hear the feedback. It's too late in the process to make significant changes, and we don't make any meaningful changes. If we have weekly touch points on a regular basis, we are not going to be ready for that touch point, right? So the rookie mistake most teams make is they start to hustle and they do all the work trying to get ready for that weekly touch point, and eventually they exhaust themselves and they have to change the way they work, and they start sharing half-baked ideas with their customers. And so when we share low fidelity, half-baked ideas, that we actually invite our customers to co-create with us. They work in smaller increments. So instead of, if I'm Facebook, instead of putting a really complex timeline in front of you and saying, what do you think? I show you the new like, dislike, wow, sad icon interactions, and I show you 3 or 4 variations, and I get really good qualitative feedback on a very small part of my product. And because I'm doing it every week, or the really good teams are doing it many times a week, you're able to do this over and over again and cover all the different parts of your product, which you're never going to do in a full-blown usability test of everything, because you don't have the time to look at those little details. And we know those little details are what delights our customers and what really makes a difference between a product that we can use and a product that drives us nuts. So this weekly touch point becomes a really good forcing function. And if you want to see an awesome example of this, and I'll send this out afterwards, Tom Chi, I think 2 years ago in San Francisco at Mind the Product, talked about how the Google Glass team brought in customers to try out prototypes twice a week. And it completely changed the way that they worked. So this, I think, is the most powerful part of this definition, is that all of your teams need a regular cadence of interacting with your customers. Okay, so we've talked already a lot about why it has to be done by the team making the product decisions. If they design the research and they're responsible for how good the research is, they have no choice but to believe it. If they think there's a problem with the research, they have to change the way they do their own research. And then the second part of this is a centralized research team can't possibly know all the nuances of the context that the product team is working in. So again, if I use Facebook as an example, if Facebook had a centralized user research team, they would probably be focusing on big picture questions like, how do people want to connect with their friends? How do we build more connection around the world? Those might be perfectly valid research questions. So I'm not arguing you shouldn't have a centralized user research team, but it shouldn't be at the cost of your product teams doing their own research. Because if I work on Facebook groups, I don't really care how people want to connect with their friends. I care about how they know which friends to invite to the group they're in, or how to know how to tag a friend that isn't in the group that I want to see a post in the group, right? Like the nuances of my context are completely different from what a centralized user research team is going to think about. And again, it's those nuances that are going to lead to a good decision or a bad decision. Now, the only way this works, our product managers and our designers and our software engineers are not expert researchers, and they don't have a full day to do research. So we need to make our research activities small enough that it's feasible for them to do them every week. So one of the first things I do with teams is I break apart their notion of what research means. So we tend to think about interviews as a 30-minute interview or a 60-minute interview, and we think we have to interview 5 or 6 people before we can get meaningful information. I would rather you do a 5-minute interview every day or a 10-minute interview every other day. And over time, you're synthesizing what you're learning over the body of interviews. Thanks to usertesting.com and UserZoom and a bajillion other tools that are popping up, there is no reason why a designer can't run an unmoderated usability study on every single day's designs. So just like coders check in code every night and make sure that their build is stable, there's no reason why a designer can't look at what design progress they made that day before they go home, put it in front of users. So the next day they come to work with some feedback. That's what co-creation looks like. Ethnio, Qualaroo, Usabilla, these are all tools that make it really easy to ask our visitors one question and to get really quick feedback on one burning question. So you see something in an A/B test and you don't know why it's happening. You could, on that page, pop up one question, tell me about what you think about X, and get some fast feedback. The big one that I love that really these unmoderated prototyping tools are helping a lot is I want to break designers of the habit of testing their best design and instead testing 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 variations of one small piece of a design. Because I think this is what really is the game changer on good design. And that's possible when we can run 4 sets of usability testing, because usertesting.com makes it take no time whatsoever. So really, we have to reinvent how we think about research. And then the last piece of the definition is really it has to be in pursuit of a desired outcome. And this is for the teams that have strong research skills, like they get everything we've already talked about. This is the last piece of the puzzle. You can do really good research, and if you can't connect your research to the product decisions that you're making, you're not getting value out of your research. And we do not have time to go into this in depth, but this visual is I call it an opportunity solution tree. It's the way that I help teams evaluate the logical connections between their product decisions. So they start at the top by mapping out what's the outcome we're trying to drive this quarter. Based on what we're learning in our interviews, what are the opportunities that we see that if we addressed those opportunities would drive our outcomes? And then to start to look at what solutions would deliver on those opportunities. And then their experiments are designed to test each of the links. So they're testing, does our solution deliver on the opportunity? Does it deliver on the opportunity in a way that drives the outcome? And this becomes their discovery roadmap so that they can justify their product decisions, and they're justifying them with experimental data. Okay, I know I threw a ton at you. If you're feeling overwhelmed, I have some quick tips for just how to get started. So no matter where you are in this process, where you fell in any of those scenarios, the very first thing I would do is think about how you can get to 100% dedicated overtime trios, right? So even if it's just one, if you have 10 product teams, even if you can get one of your teams fully resourced so they can act as a dedicated trio on that product over time, that alone, you're going to see a huge benefit because they're going to be able to learn the context, they're going to understand how the metrics move, they're going to try a lot of things, and they're going to build up this repertoire of knowing how to move the numbers. The second thing is I would start looking at how you're managing your teams by outcomes versus outputs. If you're using OKRs, you're probably already thinking about outcomes, but I would push the envelope on this. Just because you set an outcome as a goal doesn't mean you're not managing by outputs. How often are you making feature suggestions? How often are you giving feedback on how they reach that outcome? And are you giving them enough latitude to really co-create with the customers? And then the biggest thing that I see impact the way a team works is getting a regular touch point with a customer on the calendar. And so the way that I teach this to teams, if you have to hustle every week to find a customer to talk to, you are not going to do it every week. So in week 1, I teach them how to automate this process. So my goal is that they show up on Monday morning and they didn't have to do anything. And somewhere on their calendar, they have 30 minutes booked with the customer where they can interview them, they can prototype test with them, they can co-create with them, they can do all kinds of these small research activities, always on the calendar every week. If you have a consumer product or you have an enterprise website or mobile app where your customers are coming to a website, the best way to automate the recruiting process is to use something like Qualaroo or Ethnio to pop up a 1-question survey. Are you available for an interview right now for 20 minutes? I'll give you 20 bucks. Teams turn it on, they get a yes, they turn it off.
I love it.
That is by far the easiest way to recruit. If that's not possible, there's other things you can do. You can work with your customer support teams and say, when you encounter a customer that has this problem, schedule them for an interview. You can work with your sales teams. When you encounter a prospect who has this objection, schedule an interview. You just want to look for what's the thing you can automate so that your product teams aren't constantly scrambling for interview participants. And then I would focus on getting them to build the habit of the weekly cadence and not worry about are their research methods sound, right? Because here's what I've seen. If teams interview over and over again, they will learn how to interview better. If they user test over and over again, they will get better at user testing. If they do them occasionally, they will never get better at them. So I would not worry about the details of how to do all this stuff until they've built that weekly habit. And then once that weekly habit is strong, then there's a ton to dive into around how do we do it well? How do we do it to avoid all these biases? But just by having your teams work together, you're removing the hippo from the conversation because managers are driving outcomes, not outputs. The trio is making decisions, not just the product manager. You've removed the factory floor because the 3 people are working together, jointly making decisions. And what happens is the team takes ownership. And when the team takes ownership, we get more creative problem solving, we hit our deadlines, we have fewer bugs. Hopefully we get happier customers. So let me pause there and take questions.
Teresa, thank you. That's fantastic. We've got a question from Lauren Antonelli. Lauren, I'm going to unmute you.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, Lauren.
Hi. And Teresa, so many of the things that you've talked to me previously about, I'm so happy to see in here too. And as somebody who tried to just at least interview one customer a day, that's working for us. So we took your advice and it's been great.
Awesome.
And now we're working on, one a week. Sorry, one a day was a lot. One a week. Now we're working on each PM, trying to do one a week. So that's our next goal. So here's a question for you. We've gotten our company on board with having customer input drive our future strategy rather than sort of how we've been normally operating, which is, strategic in out to customers, right? So we've decided we want to build some kind of customer engine where we can take inputs and then come up with solutions that can drive the business. But I think one thing you hit on a little bit earlier that I have a question about is do you have any suggestions about how we can successfully set up that process of which we take what customers are saying and we sort of evaluate them and try to place them into tactics or stories that we can create or test when, as you say, like people and teams interpret things very differently based on what customers say? Will it always just be a little bit subjective, or do you have any tips for how to work through that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I'd be careful about trying to come up with a company-wide process. I think one of the values of this shift to continuous discovery and like moving to trios and outcome-based management is we're trying to decentralize this, right? We want to empower our teams to truly co-create with our customers, right? So if we're trying to put rules around how that's done, we're really restricting how we co-create. Because every customer is going to want to co-create a little bit differently around different contexts. For one part of the product, it might look one way. For another part of the product, it might look another way. So don't think about this as your company process. Think about it as your company creating with your customers. So you obviously can't dictate your customer's process. I will say collaborating as a trio is a skill that has to be developed.
Right.
So most of us grew up in a business world where we work in functional silos, and while we all talk about cross-functional teams and the value of collaborating, we don't have a lot of experience actually doing it. And one of the best examples of this is if we look at executive teams, why is it so hard for us to get aligned, right? Because we don't know how to collaborate. We don't know how to work across functions. We don't know how to work across the entire business. If we can't do it well as executives, it's hard for us to expect our teams to do it well. So part of this process is everybody from the top down has to reinforce the team is responsible, not the product manager, not the designer, not the tech lead. The whole team is responsible, and really supporting that learning curve around truly collaborating. And so one of the examples I hear often, Teresa, what would you do in this scenario where the product manager likes one design and the designer likes a different design? How do you resolve that? My answer is find a third design that both of you like.
Right.
And that should be obvious, right? Like if our product manager doesn't like it, in theory, it's because it doesn't meet a business need. And if our designer doesn't like it, in theory, it's because it doesn't meet a user need. We don't want a solution that doesn't meet either of those needs, right? So when we're not aligned, usually it's a sign that there's more work to do. We haven't found the solution yet. Now, again, if what's driving our schedule is our delivery cadence, which it should, but we also need to give our team some wiggle room so that when they're stuck and they haven't found that solution, we give them more time to work and we don't revert back to just opinion battles.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. So Archie Miller had a question. He wanted to know if we can do a follow-up on opportunity solution tree. I know that's probably a webinar unto itself. I think we can send some a little bit of resource there, Teresa, and maybe if there's enough interest in that mysterious slide 26 that you put up there, we can potentially do a follow-up in the future. Is that right?
Yeah, so at a minimum, I'll send out the one article I have on it. I will tell you, the number one request I get from both my blog readers and from the teams that I work with is they want more about the opportunity solution tree. I am trying as hard as I can to write a book about it. It's a really hard tool to talk about in the abstract. The best way to talk about it is with real concrete examples. And I can't use the examples from the teams that I work with. What I'm doing is I'm building up kind of a made-up case study that I'm hoping illustrates it. So yes, I would be happy to do a webinar about the opportunity solution tree. I probably need some time
Sure.
to be ready for that.
Great. And Christine Garofoli, another one of our great collaborative game moderators, asked, what were the names of those automatic recruiting tools? You mentioned them quickly.
Yeah, Ethnio, so it's ethn.io. It's really like a survey tool that like will pop. You've probably seen them on websites where a little survey pops up in the bottom right corner usually. It's usually like 1 or 2 questions. Ethnio's a really big one. Qualaroo, I think still exists, was I think the first company to do it. I know a lot of teams use Usabilla, so it's Usabilia, I think, might be 2 L's. Again, it's just, there's a lot of, I think Intercom probably has something similar. They're just tools that like allows you to intercept a visitor when they're on your website and pull them into some other experience, whether it's a survey or you can ask them to pick up the phone and do an interview. So it's a really good way to use your website or mobile app visitor population as your pool that you recruit from.
Cool. So I have a question for you. We don't have any more questions in the audience, and we're getting close to time here. But so talking to customers sounds awful. And I say that part jokingly, but also in terms of, you had mentioned designers potentially getting feedback on a design on a daily basis on something they did. And it feels to me like that requires a certain type of human being who is willing to hear slightly negative or critical things about the blood, sweat, and tears they're putting out every day. How do you teach folks in these things, and maybe this is its own separate webinar or a completely different conversation, but how do you teach people to kind of be willing to hear those things? Because I suspect that most people avoid it because it doesn't feel good.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the hardest things that I work on with teams and coaching. I think we have at least 100 years of business history where people are rewarded in business for being right. Right? So we get promoted when we have the right answers. We get bonuses when we're right. And so we've built business culture around being right, knowing the answers. But what we're seeing in the world of product, and I personally believe product is pulling all business in this direction, is that we're starting to acknowledge that we can't predict the future. There is a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of uncertainty. And the mindset we have to adopt is that we are going to be wrong more often than we're right. And that we can't look at our job as having the answers, but rather as having a process that gets us to an answer.
And do you have a point of view on what's more expensive, Teresa? So throwing a lot of darts out there and hoping that you're right is the way most people do it. But it feels like you're making decisions and things are happening, and you only get proven wrong once, and potentially in a significant way where it hurts for a little while, but then you forget about it. But it sounds to me like you're saying that continuous discovery is actually even though it feels like more work, it's a significantly less expensive way to get to the right answer with your customer.
Yeah, I think especially in the last 5 years, but let's say the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen product management practices evolve really quickly. And here's what's driving it. This didn't happen in the 1960s, because when we were building products in the 1960s, our differentiating factors were, can we get on the store shelf? And when someone bought our product, our relationship with them ended. We didn't go home with them and watch how they used their soap, right? So we didn't get feedback on.
Well, I don't know. I wasn't alive in the 60s, Teresa.
So we didn't get feedback on, like, did you get clean? Did you like the smell? Like, we did surveys after the fact, right? But we didn't have a good feedback loop. With the internet age, not only do we have a really good feedback loop, we get to watch every single step of the way. And now that we can see every single step of the way, it is painfully clear how often we're wrong. And that's what I think is driving this evolution, is that for those of us that are measuring what people are actually doing, it is hard to continue to believe that we're always right. So that's a little bit of a oh no moment, right? And the only rational thing is to course correct and figure out, okay, how do we get to a right answer faster?
Well, I like ending on rational answers, and so we'll stop there. Teresa Torres, thank you very much. This has been great. Appreciate our audience joining us today. We've recorded this webinar and we'll be sharing it out to the council membership so that you can review it again if you'd like, or share it with some of the folks on your teams who you want to teach about continuous product discovery. Teresa, you can follow Teresa on Twitter at @ttorres. You can also, of course, reach her through Collaborative Gain, Teresa at collaborativegain.com. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and we will see you next time. We've got an Agile webinar on Thursday, Agile the Spotify Way with Dave Roger, who recently served as the VP of Product for Spotify, and that's going to be great as well. So if you'd like to attend that, send Brittany an email, Brittany at collaborativegain.com, and we'll send you an invite for that. Thank you all. Thanks, Teresa, and have a great afternoon.